Hi everyone, Fran here. This video is going to run through Somerset's time as Lord Protector over Edward VI. So before I go through any significant content, I just want to clarify who Somerset is. Now, Henry VIII and Jane Seymour had a son who would become King Edward VI of England. Now, Jane Seymour has two brothers that we are going to look at in relation to this video. Edward Seymour is going to be referred to as Somerset for the majority of this video. He is one of Edward's uncles. Thomas Seymour is another of Edward's uncles, and whilst he will be called Thomas Seymour throughout this entire video, he is going to crop up in a little moment. Starting with government then, when Henry is essentially on his deathbed, he is very aware that Edward is not 18 and that this could make him very vulnerable, and therefore he acts before he dies by making a Regency Council of 16 trusted advisors from both the Reform and Conservative faction to rule on Edward's behalf until he's 18, which is a good move in the sense that Henry's being proactive to try and intervene on a problem that he can see on the horizon. Now, when Edward takes over, this council is full of people preoccupied with their own ambitions and their own power, and a decision is made quite early on to have an individual lead this council. And the person given this task would be Edward Seymour. This, on paper, is a good decision. He's got a good reputation from his involvement in the Scottish Wars. He's Edward's uncle. He's a reformer. So on paper at this point, with no hindsight of what goes on after this point, you can understand why that decision is made. And he will become Lord Protector and get the title Duke of Somerset also. However, Somerset does encounter opposition. First of all, we've got Thomas Wriothesley, who doesn't like the idea that Somerset is assuming so much power. He thinks that Somerset is going beyond the power he should have. This opposition is not significant in the sense that Thomas Wriothesley is dismissed and is arrested, so his opposition doesn't lead to any serious consequence, but it does exist nonetheless, and it does raise interesting questions for this course in terms of power and how much power Somerset should have in this situation. Is he getting to a point where he's rivaling the power of either the monarch or perhaps overpowering the council? The second person who shows opposition towards Somerset is his brother Thomas Seymour, and this is much more serious in terms of the road it leads down. Thomas Seymour looks at the situation he's in, sees his brother with a lot of power, and is in a nutshell jealous. Somerset knows this, he can see it, and he does act to try and almost appease Thomas Seymour. So he gives him a barony, he's given the title of Lord Admiralship, he's given a seat on the Regency Council, but these measures are not enough for Thomas Seymour. He's still wanting more power. He's still not liking the situation he's seeing in terms of how much power his brother has. And we get now a series of decisions that Thomas Seymour makes in terms of trying to increase his power. He starts talking to the king, kind of has the mentality towards him of, you have to ask Somerset for your money, like you shouldn't need to do that, you're the king, why are you a beggarly king? I'd get rid of him if I was you. So he's trying to slowly talk into the king's ear and try and get Somerset removed, something that won't work. He marries Catherine Parr, the wife of Henry VIII who survives, and in her household is also Princess Elizabeth. I'm not going to go too far into the scandal surrounding Elizabeth, but you do need to know that Thomas Seymour, following the death of Catherine Parr, will try and make a move to marry Princess Elizabeth, an attempt that will ultimately fail. The big instance we need to know about is that there is an attempt in January 1549, again a year that you're going to keep hearing again and again, whereby Thomas Seymour almost makes his bid for power and he tries to kidnap the king. He does actually get into the king's bed chambers, but in that process, he wakes up one of the king's dogs, who starts barking, and Thomas Seymour proceeds to kill said dog for barking. In the wake of this, Thomas Seymour sent to the Tower and will be later down the line executed. However, what's important here is that Somerset doesn't have control over his brother, and things escalate to a point where the safety of the king is jeopardised. So compared to Thomas Wriothesley, Thomas Seymour's opposition is much more significant in many senses. The final thing I'm going to look at here is the fall of Somerset. It feels weird doing it in question 1, but it does come under the government key question. So when I'm sort of going back in time later in this PowerPoint, don't be confused. So John Dudley, who will be Northumberland, and Thomas Wriothesley, again, he's not been executed, he's just kind of arrested and taken out of post, decides Somerset's rule needs to come to an end. A lot is going wrong in 1549, as we will see in this year, and they make a decision that it just needs to end. They try to get Princess Mary's support, who will be Queen Mary later down the line. She decides to stay out of it. She knows if this goes wrong, the implications could be bad for her. Seymour is alerted that things are not looking great for him in a nutshell. He takes possession of the king, who withdraws to Windsor Castle. And meanwhile, the council are kind of formally putting together evidence of mismanagement. Somerset does ultimately, in this situation, surrender on the condition that no treason charges are pressed against him. And in that sort of instance, he is arrested. It's kind of all agreed that that will be the case. And at that point, Somerset has officially fallen, and John Dudley, who will later be called Northumberland, becomes the leader of the council instead. In terms of the end point of the story, this appears more so when we look at Northumberland. Somerset will be given a seat back on the council, but when he tries to claim back his old job, so to speak, tries to gain power over the Regency Council once more, he is executed for scheming to overthrow the government. So we will look at that in more detail later down the line, but it is just a point of interest in terms of where Somerset goes after the point he is arrested and is no longer Lord Protector. Secondly, then, we're going to look at foreign policy, and as was the case with government, there is a worry about the fact that Edward VI is not of age, that he's not 18. The worry here is that international powers may exploit the situation in England, and namely France might exploit the situation. Somerset's aims are quite directed at Scotland here, as you'll notice. So he wants to reassert the claim of Edward I to the Scottish throne. He's going to reinforce this claim through the marriage of Edward VI to Mary Queen of Scots. And again, linking to Scotland, he wants to unite the crowns of England and Scotland together. So this is quite an ambitious foreign policy that Somerset wants to succeed in. In terms of Mary Queen of Scots then, Henry VIII had tried to arrange the marriage of Edward and Mary Queen of Scots. However, this marriage had not happened. They were never married to each other. And going forward, people on the Regency councils have hesitations about this marriage arrangement. They're scared that France might use this marriage as a backdoor into English politics. And what I mean by this is, Mary Queen of Scots' mum, Mary of Guise, is French, and therefore the French might use this marriage alliance to try and start kind of impacting English politics. So councillors are worried about that. Secondly, they're worried about the fact that Mary Queen of Scots is related to the Tudor dynasty, and therefore if Edward VI was to die, she would have a claim to the throne, and that also worried some people. So this doesn't materialise, they won't get married. However, it is something to consider as part of the question on foreign policy and succession under Somerset. Somerset's strategy then in relation to Scotland is to be quite aggressive, and he will invade in September 1547. He's going to invade with 16,000 men, 4,000 cavalry, 30 warships and 50 supply ships. So this is quite a substantial invasion. At the beginning of this invasion, England sees success, and the example you can use is the Battle of Pinkie, and that there are going to be 25 garrisons over the Scottish border stretching as far as the north of Dundee. However, the success doesn't continue and things start to get worse. Somerset can't capture the castles at Edinburgh or Dunbar. Furthermore, this is a very costly invasion. It is costing a lot of money to fund this war, and we're going to talk about the impact and consequence of that in a second. Somerset is unable to blockade the Firth of the Forth, which, if you look on the map on the screen, it's a body of water just above Edinburgh, and it's important that he blockade that to prevent any French ships from landing in Scotland to aid Scotland. The Scots in this war allied with France, which again is not great news for Somerset, and the French will send reinforcements of 10,000 troops. Mary, Queen of Scots, as part of this alliance, is removed from Scotland, goes to France, where she is engaged to the Dauphin of France, Francis I, as he will be known when he is king. So again, this actually makes Scotland and France closer allies, which is not great news for Somerset. And therefore, the consequences of Somerset's foreign policy are quite disastrous overall, despite that initial success at the beginning. Somerset, in order to fund this war, debases the coin, and whilst he raises £537,000, the impact of this policy is inflation and that it becomes much worse in England. Also, there becomes a threat of invasion by France in 1549, and by the end of this video, when we've been through the key questions, you will know why that year is really significant and not the year that you want a threat of invasion. The next area that we're going to look at is religion under Somerset, and this period of time can be seen as one where we see ceremonial changes to what you can see in churches and how masses are delivered, as opposed to doctrinal changes, which are changes to the belief system of the church. In 1547, we get a series of changes from the denunciation of images in London. We get the injunctions, which are sort of a list of religious expectations, which again were a shift towards Protestantism, and Parliament will meet to reverse laws such as the 6 Articles, which together demonstrate a shift towards Protestantism. We get the dissolution of chantries in 1547 in the December, which again is a room of a church where you would pray for the souls of the dead, namely those in purgatory, and therefore these rooms being dissolved or shut down indicates a broader belief of Protestants that purgatory doesn't exist. We get the Act of Uniformity in 1549, which banned Latin masses and brought about the Book of Common Prayer. The Book of Common Prayer is quite interesting, and it does reinforce the idea that under Somerset we don't get a radical shift towards Protestantism. We can summarise his religious policy as somewhat moderate, and this is echoed in the book, which had Protestant elements such as Latin replacing English, but also some areas that were either vague, such as transubstantiation, whether the bread and wine changes into the body and blood of Christ, and then there are some elements that are still quite Catholic in nature, such as priests being able or recommended to wear the coat, which is a more elaborate garment of clothing, as opposed to the surplice, which was much more plain. So the Book of Common Prayer is a good example of the idea that Somerset and his religious policies are not radically Protestant, but moderate. It is quite interesting then that this Book of Common Prayer is going to catalyse a rebellion, the Western Rebellion, which is something we're going to look at in a second. But overall, the picture you should be getting here is that there are changes. They are primarily changes to ceremony and what you can see in church and how a church service goes about. However, the changes are moderate. Next, we're going to look at society under Somerset, and we're going to focus on the 2 rebellions, the Western Rebellion and Kett's Rebellion. These both happen in 1549, which when you look at 1549 as a year and everything else that happens it brings up a key debate in Tudor history, which concerns whether 1549 was the worst year in Tudor history. On this slide at the minute is the Western Rebellion. I'm not going to read it all out. The key things you need to know is that there are different causes of this rebellion. For exam purposes, it would be beneficial for you to have decided which cause is the most important and to rank these factors. So we've got religious causes surrounding the Book of Common Prayer, social causes surrounding class antagonism, and economic causes centred primarily around enclosure. In terms of the events, the key points you need to know is that whilst this rebellion is geographically somewhat limited to sort of Cornwall and Devon areas of England, it takes a lot of putting down. This takes multiple battles, and even in the last paragraph, when Lord Russell thinks the rebellion's over and he's defeated the rebels, they regroup, and then there is another encounter, and that suggests a real threat of this rebellion. The fact that after multiple violent encounters, the rebels are still going. So in terms of this rebellion, some key points is multiple factors causing it. Which one do you think is most important, down to the least? You may look at geographical scale, and most importantly, you need to consider how much effort and energy is put into stopping this rebellion. The second rebellion is Kett's Rebellion. However, whilst I call it the second rebellion, they both happen in the same year. Western and Kett's Rebellion happened in 1549. And again, that is something to consider in itself, the fact we have two rebellions happening somewhat simultaneously. The causes are more economic and social. We've not got as quite a diverse range of causes here, but again, there is more than one. In terms of the events, what's interesting about this rebellion is the discipline. In the second paragraph in the event section, we get the rebels setting up a camp in Mousehold and being very disciplined. They have a governing council, they set up their grievances, they have like a justice system, and this is quite notable about this rebellion is the organisation of the rebels and the strength of the leadership in Robert Kett. What is quite worrying about this rebellion, if you are the government, if you are the monarch, is that they take Norwich, and this is the second largest city in England. So the fact that rebels have not only taken over an area of England, but a significant area in England is also worrying. Thirdly, this rebellion again takes force to be put down, and what is going to be notable here is that the individual who succeeds in doing this is John Dudley, who will become Northumberland and will be the topic of a later video on the reign of Edward VI. So again, whilst this rebellion does ultimately fail, as does the Western one, there are moments in these rebellions where we get a real sense of threat, we get a real sense of worry if you are the government, and it's these factors, not only about each rebellion separately, but also when you put them together, considering they happen in the same year, which give rebellions under Somerset a bit of a perhaps distinct edge against the rebellions we look at across the course and across the other Tudor monarchs. The final area that we're going to look at then is the economy under Somerset. Finance, we have already mentioned the point raised that debasement is Somerset's financial policy as opposed to reforming the finance structure itself. And whilst that does bring in money, the consequence of inflation is really negative for people in England. I mentioned in the religious policy section under Somerset that chantries were dissolved, and whilst in that section it was spoken of in religious terms, it can actually be seen as a financial move, the idea that shutting down these chantries would kind of see an increase in money. In terms of employment, England is in a situation, broadly speaking, whereby the population is increasing, but job opportunities are not increasing at the same rate, and therefore England is coming into issues surrounding vagrancy and crime. In 1547, the Vagrancy Act is passed, and that asks, orders even church and local authorities to provide relief for the impotent poor, the poor who are in poverty through no fault of their own. However, idle poor, those just considered lazy and not pulling their weight sort of mentality. If they were unemployed for more than 3 days, then they would become kind of victim to the following offences, if you like. The first offence would be that they are sold into slavery for 2 years. Second offence, sold into slavery for life, and the third would be the death penalty. As you can maybe almost imagine here, this wasn't properly implemented. It was a highly unpopular policy. So whilst a measure was put in place against the idle poor, it wasn't implemented. There is also a court of request put in place to help the poor in their cases against the wealthy. In terms of agriculture, there are harvest failures in the short reign of Edward. 1548 in particular, there is a bad harvest failure, which leads to an increase in prices and therefore the poorest in society being unable to afford food. What the issue here is that Somerset and the Privy Council seem more bothered by public disorder and rebellion stemming from food shortages rather than the existence of poverty in society. They're more concerned about how a food shortage may lead to violence rather than how do we help these people out in terms of being able to access food. Somerset does take action against enclosure in a similar way to which Wolsey is seen as a friend to the poor. So is Somerset. There is a tax on sheep introduced. There are investigations into enclosure in the Midlands. So Somerset does act to kind of keep an eye on enclosure. But the sheep tax, for example, is repealed in 1550. These are not very popular policies. So again, we need to balance the existence of a policy being brought in with how successful it is and how long it lasts.
Big thank you to Fran for that video on the Duke of Somerset and the first stage of Edward's reign. Lots more to come, looking through the rest of the mid-Tudors and on to Elizabeth. Also, already on the channel, there's videos going through Henry VII and all the key questions on him, on Henry VIII as well. So check out our Tudors playlists, and if you found this helpful, then please show your support for Fran by hitting the like, leave any comments, and subscribe to the channel for more of the same, and also stuff on other history topics and also covering A-level politics. Thank you very much for watching.